September 20th, 1963, Washington, D.C. The Senate caucus room was packed with reporters, federal agents, and curious citizens watching something unprecedented in American history. A short, balding 59-year-old man sat at a witness table, chain-smoking, lucky strikes, about to commit what the Mafia considered the ultimate sin. His name was Joseph Valachi, and he was about to say the two words on national television that would change organized crime forever. Cosa Nostra. For the first time in history, a made member of the Mafia was going to break Omertà, the sacred code of silence. He was going to name names, describe rituals, expose murders, and detail the entire structure of the most secretive criminal organization in America. But here's what those television cameras didn't show. Joe Valachi wasn't a hero. He wasn't brave. He was terrified, because 14 months earlier, inside the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Vito Genovese had given him the kiss of death, and Joe, in his paranoia and desperation, had murdered the wrong man to save himself. This is the story of how one kiss and one mistake destroyed 400 years of Mafia secrecy. September 22nd, 1897, East Harlem, New York. Joe Valachi was born in a fourth-floor walk-up tenement on 107th Street to Italian immigrants who worked themselves to death for pennies. His father, Dominic, collected garbage for the city, hauling rotting trash 12 hours a day for wages that barely covered rent. His mother, Maria, took in laundry from wealthy families uptown, scrubbing other people's bloodstains and wine spills from linens she would never own. They spoke broken English and clung to old country traditions like they were life rafts in a drowning sea. The Valachi family lived in 2 rooms with no heat, sharing a bathroom down the hall with 6 other families. Young Joe slept on a mattress with his 3 brothers, listening to his father cough through the walls every night, watching roaches crawl across the ceiling. By age 7, Joe understood that honest work was a slow death sentence. His father worked himself into the ground and had nothing to show for it except exhaustion and resentment. But the men who controlled the neighborhood, the gangsters who ran numbers and bootleg operations, they wore nice suits and drove expensive cars, and nobody dared disrespect them. Joe wanted that power. Not the money, not yet. He wanted people to step aside when he walked down the street. He wanted to be feared instead of invisible. By age 11, Joe was running errands for local gangsters, delivering messages and packages he knew better than to open. By 13, he was stealing cars with a crew of other Italian kids, hot wiring Fords and Chevrolets and selling them to chop shops in the Bronx. By 15, Joe had dropped out of school completely because education seemed pointless when the only men with money in the neighborhood were criminals. Joe wasn't particularly smart. He could barely read. His math skills never progressed beyond basic addition. He wasn't particularly tough either. At 5'5" and 140 pounds, Joe got into fights and usually lost. But he was loyal, eager, and willing to do whatever it took to earn. When a couple told him to beat someone, Joe beat them. When told to keep his mouth shut, Joe stayed silent. When told to take the fall for a more important member, Joe went to jail without complaint. Those qualities, that blind, obedient loyalty, make perfect soldiers in the Mafia. And by his mid-20s, Joe Valachi had caught the attention of men who could make him exactly that. In 1930, at 33 years old, Joe Valachi was formally inducted into what he would later call Cosa Nostra. The ceremony took place in a basement somewhere in the Bronx. The exact location Joe could never quite remember because he was blindfolded during the car ride there. When the blindfold came off, he stood in a dimly lit room with 30 made men forming a circle around him. These were the most dangerous criminals in New York, men responsible for hundreds of murders, men who controlled entire neighborhoods through fear and violence. And they were there to make Joe one of them. The boss, whose face Joe recognized, but whose name he was told not to speak aloud that night, stood in the center holding a gun and a knife. Joe's sponsor, a capo named Dominic the Gap Petrilli, pricked Joe's trigger finger with a pin until blood dripped onto a picture of a Catholic saint. The picture was placed in Joe's cupped hands and set on fire. Joe held it while his skin burned, the flames consuming the saint's face, and swore an oath in Italian and broken English. He would never betray this organization, never speak about it to outsiders, never cooperate with law enforcement, and accept death as the only punishment if he violated these rules. The burning picture represented Joe's soul if he broke Omerta. When the flames finally died, Joe's hands were blistered and shaking. The boss approached him, kissed him on both cheeks, and said the words that would define the next 32 years of Joe's life. "You are born again. You are now part of this family. We live by the gun and the knife, and we die by the gun and the knife." When the ceremony ended, Joe Valachi was no longer just a street thug, running numbers and stealing cars. He was a made man in what would become the Genovese crime family, a soldier in an army that ran New York's underworld. He couldn't be touched by rival gangs without commission approval. He had access to lucrative rackets. He had the protection and respect of the most powerful criminal organization in America, and he had sworn an oath that demanded his silence, even in the face of life imprisonment or execution. For the next 3 decades, Joe would live by that oath without question, until one kiss in a prison yard made the oath meaningless. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Joe worked his way up from nothing, though up is a relative term. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't even a capo. He was a soldier, the lowest rank in the Mafia hierarchy, and that's all he would ever be. Joe didn't have the intelligence or charisma to lead. What he had was reliability. When you needed someone to run a numbers operation in East Harlem, Joe did it efficiently and kicked up the proper percentage to his capo. When you needed a truck hijacked or a warehouse burglarized, Joe assembled the crew and got it done. When you needed someone roughed up over a gambling debt, Joe brought the pipe. And occasionally, when the family needed someone killed, Joe pulled the trigger or held the victim down while someone else did. Joe's first murder happened in 1932. The victim was a small-time bookie who had been skimming from the family stake for months. Joe and 2 other soldiers drove the man to a warehouse in Queens under the pretense of discussing a new territory arrangement. The bookies sat in a chair, smoking, talking about how much money they could all make together. Joe stood behind him. When the signal came, Joe wrapped a rope around the man's neck and pulled. The bookie thrashed, kicked over the chair, clawed at his own throat. It took 3 minutes for him to stop moving. Joe vomited in a corner afterward, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. But he learned an important lesson that night. Violence gets easier with repetition. By his 5th murder, Joe's hands stayed steady. By his 10th, he felt nothing at all. Prison changes men in predictable ways. Some find religion, some find education. Vito Genovese found enemies everywhere. By 1962, Vito had been in Atlanta for 3 years, and his paranoia had metastasized into something pathological. He saw traitors in every conversation, rats in every corner, FBI informants in every cell block. Vito ran the prison like he ran the streets outside, conducting mafia business through smuggled messages, ordering hits through coded letters, maintaining power through fear and violence. But federal prosecutors were building new cases against several Genovese family members, and Vito was convinced someone on the inside was talking. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to send a message. And Joe Valachi, a low-level soldier who had been complaining about money problems and making desperate comments about his family's financial situation, seemed like the perfect target. June 1962, Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Joe was working his usual job in the prison tailor shop when Vito Genovese walked in. They hadn't spoken in weeks. Vito approached Joe slowly, looked him directly in the eyes, and kissed him on the cheek. Then Vito walked away without saying a word. Joe stood there, frozen, understanding exactly what had just happened. In Mafia culture, the kiss of death is not a metaphor. It's a literal signal that you have been marked for execution. Vito had just publicly announced that Joe Valachi was going to die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And everyone in that prison who mattered now knew it. For the next 3 months, Joe lived in absolute terror. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. He watched every person who approached him, analyzing their body language for signs of attack. He knew how prison hits worked. A sharpened piece of metal in the shower, poison in the food, an arranged accident in the yard. Joe went to prison officials and begged for protective custody, but he couldn't explain why he needed it without admitting he was a made member of the Mafia. So instead, he armed himself with a makeshift weapon, a 2-foot piece of iron pipe wrapped in tape, and waited for the inevitable. September 20th, 1962. Exactly 3 months after the kiss, Joe was in the prison recreation yard when he saw a man walking toward him. The man was Joseph Di Palermo, another inmate Joe vaguely knew. But in Joe's paranoid, deteriorating mind, Di Palermo looked like John Saup, a hitman Joe believed Vito had hired to kill him. Di Palermo kept walking closer. Joe pulled out the iron pipe. Di Palermo smiled and said something Joe couldn't hear over the blood rushing in his ears. And Joe Valachi beat Joseph Di Palermo to death with that pipe in front of 200 witnesses, screaming that Saup was trying to kill him, that this was self-defense that Vito sent him. Except it wasn't Saup. It was Di Palermo, a burglar with no connection to the Genovese family, who was probably just walking over to ask Joe for a cigarette. Joe Valachi had murdered an innocent man because Vito Genovese's kiss had driven him insane. The killing should have resulted in a death sentence. Joe was caught red-handed. 200 witnesses saw it. There was no legal defense. But federal prosecutors saw an opportunity. They had been investigating the Mafia for decades and getting nowhere because of Omertà. Every witness refused to talk. Every suspect stayed silent. Every trial ended in acquittals or mistrials because nobody would testify. But Joe Valachi, facing execution for murdering the wrong man, facing death from Vito either way, suddenly had nothing left to lose. FBI agent James Flynn sat down with Joe in an interrogation room and made him an offer. Tell us everything about the Mafia. Testify before Congress. Give us names and details and proof that this organization exists, and we'll protect you and your family. Joe asked for a cigarette. He smoked it down to the filter. Then he said the 2 words that would change history. Cosa Nostra. For the next year, Joe Valachi told federal investigators everything. He described the initiation ceremony, the burning saint picture, the blood oath. He explained the family structure, boss, underboss, capo, soldier. He named over 350 made members across multiple families. He detailed dozens of murders, including ones he personally committed. He described how businesses were infiltrated, how unions were corrupted, how politicians were bought. He drew organizational charts showing who reported to whom. He provided addresses of mob headquarters. He identified front businesses. And most importantly, he confirmed something FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly denied for years, that a national organized crime syndicate existed in America called La Cosa Nostra. The intelligence Joe provided was unprecedented. For decades, the Mafia had operated in complete secrecy. Law enforcement knew individual criminals existed, new crimes were being committed, but couldn't prove a larger organization was coordinating everything. Joe's testimony changed that overnight. Suddenly, the FBI had a roadmap. They had names, they had structures, they had a proof, and they had a witness willing to testify publicly. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who had made organized crime his personal crusade, saw Joe Valachi as the breakthrough he had been waiting for. In September 1963, Kennedy arranged for Joe to testify before Senator John McClellan's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. It would be the first time in American history that a made member of the Mafia spoke publicly about the organization, and it would be broadcast live on national television. September 27, 1963. The Senate hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Cameras from every major television network were positioned around the room. Reporters fought for seats. Senator McClellan gavelled the hearing to order and introduced the witness, Joseph Valachi, age 59, convicted murderer, narcotics trafficker, and member of organized crime. Joe walked to the witness table wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit right. He looked like somebody's uncle, not a dangerous criminal. He was short, balding, nervous, smoking constantly. When he started talking, his voice was scratchy from decades of cigarettes. He spoke in a thick New York accent, mispronouncing words, getting confused about dates. But what he said was electric. For 6 days, Joe Valachi testified about the Mafia. He described murders in graphic detail, naming victims and killers. He explained how the commission worked, how the 5 families divided New York. He testified about drug trafficking, illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering. He named Vito Genovese as his boss. He described Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno. He talked about the Appalachian meeting disaster. He explained why he killed Di Palermo in prison, describing Vito's kiss of death. Millions of Americans watched, transfixed, as this ordinary-looking man calmly discussed murder, extortion, and corruption like he was describing a day at the office. The testimony was shocking, not because of the violence. People knew the Mafia was violent. It was shocking because Joe made it sound so normal, so mundane, so much like a business. The Mafia's reaction was predictable. Joe Valachi became the most hated man in organized crime overnight. Death contracts were issued on him and his family. His wife Carmela and their children were placed in witness protection. Made men were ordered to kill Joe on sight if they ever got the chance. Mafia bosses publicly dismissed Joe as a low-level nobody whose testimony was lies and exaggeration. But privately, they were terrified, because Joe had exposed the one thing that kept the Mafia powerful: secrecy. Once America knew Cosa Nostra existed, knew how it operated, knew who the bosses were, law enforcement could target them systematically. The FBI created specialized organized crime units. Prosecutors developed RICO statutes that could charge entire organizations, not just individual criminals. Wiretaps increased exponentially, and it all traced back to Joe Valachi's testimony. But here's what most people don't understand. Joe didn't testify because he was brave or righteous. He testified because he had murdered an innocent man and was desperate to avoid execution. He testified because Vito Genovese's paranoia had destroyed him psychologically. He testified because the FBI offered him the only lifeline available. In his own words later, Joe said he never wanted to break Omerta. He believed in the oath. He believed in the organization. But when Vito gave him that kiss, when Vito marked him for death, despite 30 years of loyal service, the oath became meaningless. If the Mafia could betray him, he could betray the Mafia. Joe Valachi spent the rest of his life in protective custody, mostly at La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas. He lived in isolation. No contact with other inmates. No visitors except FBI handlers. His wife divorced him. His children changed their names. He wrote a memoir called The Valachi Papers that became a bestseller and was adapted into a movie. But the money meant nothing because Joe lived in a cell, alone, waiting to die. On April 3rd, 1971, at age 67, Joe Valachi died of a heart attack in his prison cell in El Paso. No funeral, no gravestone with his real name. He was buried in an unmarked grave under an alias because, even 8 years after his testimony, the death contract remained active. Vito Genovese, the man whose kiss of death started everything, died in prison 2 years before Joe. Vito never got to see the full impact of what his paranoia had created. By kissing Joe in that prison yard, Vito had inadvertently destroyed the very thing he spent his life building. The Mafia survived Joe Valachi's testimony, but it never recovered its former secrecy and power. Federal prosecutions increased dramatically. RICO laws devastated family structures. By the 1980s and 1990s, major Mafia bosses were being convicted and sentenced to life in prison at the unprecedented rates. And every single one of those prosecutions relied on cooperating witnesses, rats, who followed the path Joe Valachi pioneered. Here's the tragic irony that history books miss. Joe Valachi was exactly what the Mafia should have protected. He was loyal for 30 years. He never complained. He served his prison sentence quietly. He wasn't a threat until Vito's paranoia made him one. If Vito had just left Joe alone, if he hadn't given that kiss, if he hadn't marked a loyal soldier for death over imaginary suspicions, Joe would have finished his sentence and gone back to running numbers in East Harlem. Instead, Vito created the first Mafia informant, and that single act of paranoid cruelty led directly to the exposure and eventual decline of La Cosa Nostra. The kiss of death was supposed to be Vito's way of maintaining control, of eliminating a suspected informant before he could do damage. Instead, it created the very thing Vito feared. Joe Valachi wasn't an informant until Vito forced him to become one. The murder of Joseph Di Palermo, the innocent man Joe killed in paranoid self-defense, was the bridge that connected Joe's loyalty to his betrayal. If Joe had killed the right man, killed the actual hitman Vito sent, federal prosecutors wouldn't have had leverage. But because Joe murdered a random inmate, because he completely lost his mind from the stress of waiting to die, he gave the FBI exactly what they needed to flip him. What makes Joe Valachi's story so disturbing isn't the violence or the betrayal. It's the waste. A man spent 30 years in an organization, committed crimes, murdered people, lived by a strict code, and believed in the life he was living. Then his boss, acting on paranoid delusions, marked him for death without evidence or trial. And that single act of internal violence did more damage to the Mafia than decades of FBI investigations ever could. Joe didn't break Omerta because he wanted to. He broke it because the organization broke him first. The Mafia always said that rats deserved death, but nobody asked why rats were created in the first place. Joe Valachi's testimony proved that the Mafia's greatest enemy wasn't law enforcement. It was their own paranoia, their own violence turned inward. their own willingness to destroy the loyal members over imaginary threats. Vito Genovese gave Joe Valachi the kiss of death in June 1962. By September 1963, Joe had testified before Congress and exposed Cosa Nostra to the world. The kiss was supposed to kill one man. Instead, it killed the Mafia's secrecy forever. And 30 years later, when John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and dozens of other mobsters followed Joe's path and became government witnesses, they were all walking a road that Joe Valachi paved with blood, paranoia, and one terrible mistake in a prison yard. The Mafia called Joe Valachi the ultimate traitor. But history should remember him as what he really was: the predictable result of an organization that valued violence over loyalty and paranoia over reason. Vito Genovese wanted to kill a rat. Instead, he created the first one,